Could I invite you to turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10? We're going to cover the first 11 verses tonight, and just in case you want to know, I've titled this sermon, Purpose to Win. Purpose to Win. So as you make your way to chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, I kind of just want to give you a preface, a quick intro as to what we've been doing for quite some time, and understanding that we've been in this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, and our goal is to deconstruct and in time reconstruct what we understand as what the gospel is intended to do. And so these are some of the understandings that we believe in thus far, that God saves people from all walks of life. God doesn't just save us. He saves us into this body of believers called His church. And as we are called to be His salt and His light in this world, God is actually purposed by unleashing His church to spread His gospel. So for us to be able to realize this and to live it out on a daily basis, we understand that we must allow the gospel to do what in each and every one of our lives? To take root, to begin to do its work so that it might mold and shape us into His likeness, so that we might be able to speak, share, live out the gospel in our communities. And it's with this belief that we now understand that the gospel isn't merely the truth in which we believe in order to be saved. It's not just about being saved, but it's intended for us to understand the truth in which we are to seek to grasp more fully every single day. And the truth in which we are to live out in our everyday life. So this is what Paul says in verse 1 of chapter 10. I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food, and all of them drank the same spiritual water. For they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated and feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. So I'm going to begin with a story, more like a confession to share with you. A friend's confession, to be more exact. And I know as you listen closely to his story, you'll probably find it to be funny and actually quite relatable. So here it goes. So this friend is he had set a goal for himself to lose some weight. Who's been there before? I have. Over a period, come on. Thank you, Jeff. So he had set a goal for himself to lose some weight. Over a period of time, he had lost a great deal of weight and was very pleased with himself. Who's been there as well? Okay, good. Okay, he had been battling with sweets all his life. One quick drive-through that has become habitual was stopping at a donut shop every morning on his way to work. There, he consumed more than his share of unnecessary calories. Now that he had some control over his eating, he was elated. He was just thrilled. One morning, however, on the way to work, he passed by the donut shop where he had failed to exercise self-control for so many times. On an impulse, he made a turn into the parking lot of the shop. What are you thinking is going to happen next? This time, it was going to be different, he was thinking. He was going to order a cup of coffee and nothing else and prove to himself once and for all that he's a new person. The old life is gone. A new life indeed has begun. So he ordered his cup of coffee and sat down to enjoy it. Any coffee lovers? Good. Oh, okay, so you're participating more now. There, across the table from him, was a man who was a mirror image of his old self, showing absolutely no self-control. Who's been there? Okay, thank you. It's like the same person, being really honest tonight. This man was drinking coffee and eating donuts covered with powdered sugar. Suddenly, this man stood up and left the table, leaving one sugar-covered donut sitting on a plate on the table right in front of him. That was too much. He saw the sign. By the way, that's a title of a song. Okay, that dates some of us here. Okay, he couldn't imagine letting this donut go to waste. So he snatched it up and snarfed it down, dropping a trail of powdered sugar down his shirt and tie. Then, to his horror, this man returned. This man had not left at all, but had only gotten up to refill his cup of coffee. So, I'm going to ask you, how could he deny that he had eaten his donut? What can he possibly say? See, in many different ways and through different forms, all of us here struggle with self-control. So from the past few weeks, we've been looking at Paul dealing with the question of meats offered to idols. This issue was first raised in chapter 8. 1 Corinthians 8:1 says, "Now regarding your question about food that has been offered to idols, yes, we know that we all have knowledge about this issue, but while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church." So for the moment, Paul allows the believers to stand where they are in their understanding of what that means. They have the right to eat meat offered to idols since there is only one God, right? They are wiser and stronger than those who have issues against eating such meats. And they understood it as being their right. They have the right to do so. So and then in chapter 9, Paul contrasts his attitudes and actions with those who insist on eating these meats. In spite of Paul's undeniable right to eat and drink at the expense of others, he sets his freedom aside so that his ministry of the gospel will be enhanced. They insist on exercising a right which is wrong and no right at all, but Paul sets aside a right that is undisputable. Last weekend, we saw Paul approach the subject of eating meats offered to idols from a very different perspective. His point is powerfully made, but it goes even beyond the issue of eating certain meats. In chapter 9, verse 24, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. Races aren't won automatically because of a desire to win or just dreaming about winning. The athlete who wins competes by outperforming other athletes who also wants to win. The athlete who wins the race is the one who most wants to win, who plans with a purpose to win, and the one who's willing to pay the cost of winning. The thing in which sets a winning athlete apart from the rest of the field is his self-control. The winning athlete disciplines every area of his life so that he may win the race. The winning athlete will choose not to stay up late because he knows his body needs to rest. He will not eat street food like everyone else because not all foods are good for your body. The athlete's life is disciplined so that he may win the prize. So I want to ask us this question tonight. If such discipline characterizes the athlete, how much more should Christians be willing to exercise self-control to win the race set before us? This question, in essence, was what Pastor Leo ended the sermon with last weekend. That if such discipline characterizes the athlete, to choose to sleep rather to choose to go out and have fun, maybe, to choose not to eat certain food because realizing that it's actually not good for your health, for your body. So if such discipline characterizes the athlete, how much more should Christians be willing to exercise self-control to win the race set before us? From our text tonight, we see Paul revealing to us the problems in Corinth are nothing new, but a repeated problem confronted by the people of Israel throughout history. The problems with the people of Israel to which Paul refers, and the problems with the church in Corinth to which Paul has exposed, are precisely the same problems that we are faced with today. Nothing new. So with our remaining time, we're going to take a survey of the Old Testament, of seeing what Paul is referring to in the first 11 verses of chapter 10. But before that, let's review again the first 5 verses. I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food, and all of them drank the same spiritual water, for they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So think for a moment with me that the people of Israel from the Old Testament times are actually the counterparts to the believers in Corinth and with believers today, us. Paul refers to them as our ancestors. While there are differences between Israel and the church, Paul simply wants his readers to sense and to understand that God's story is one continuous thread weaving through the fabric of time and space. That we have a shared history in humanity. The believers in Corinth, much like their Jewish ancestors in the faith, seem to think that their privileges as God's children guaranteed them safety and protection, and that they would surely win the race before them. Paul turns their attention to the first generation of Israelites fleeing from Egypt, showing that while they were granted many blessings, they nevertheless failed to enter into the promised land. In Numbers chapter 14, you will not enter and occupy the land I swore to give you. This is Yahweh, God speaking. The only exceptions will be Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. You said your children would be carried off as plunder. Well, I will bring them safely into the land, and they will enjoy what you have despised. But as for you, you will drop dead in this wilderness, and your children will be like shepherds wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In this way, they will pay for your faithlessness, until the last of you lies dead in the wilderness. The first blessing I want us to see in the first 5 verses of chapter 10 is this. First blessing was that of divine deliverance. All were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. In doing so, the people of Israel escaped from their captivity and from the pursuit of the Egyptian army. The New Testament parallel is the salvation from sin and death through our identification with Christ by faith. And then the second blessing that we see was that of divine identification and protection. All were enveloped by the cloud and also by the sea as they followed Moses. The New Testament parallel is maybe baptism. Essentially, baptism refers to identification with something. As baptism by immersion symbolizes our identification with Christ in his death, burial, and resurrection, so Israel's immersion in the cloud and in the sea symbolized their identification with Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses says this, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." So, who is Moses speaking of? You can be a bit more courageous and confident. Who is Moses referring to? Jesus Christ. The third blessing was that of provision. All ate from the spiritual food that God had miraculously provided. The New Testament parallel is communion. During communion, we eat of the bread and we drink from the cup. The bread symbolizes the body of our Lord Jesus broken, and the cup symbolizes the blood by which he shed on our behalf, cleansing us from sin. In John 6, Jesus says, "I tell you the truth. Moses didn't give you bread from heaven. My Father did. And now he offers you the true bread from heaven." The true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The people of Israel also had their own spiritual drink. What is that? Kool-Aid? This drink was the water, right? Water that God provided miraculously over the years of their wandering in the wilderness. So Paul identifies Christ as the spiritual rock that traveled with them. The simplest way for us to understand and make sense of this is that to recognize that he's not speaking of an actual rock, but as a spiritual rock. Christ was the source of the water. But more than that, Paul wants us to know that Christ was there with his people in their journey through the wilderness. He was there to care for his people and to meet their needs. that Christ didn't just show up in the New Testament, but Christ was indeed with the people of Israel during the Old Testament as well. So God supernaturally provided for all of their needs during their 40 years in the wilderness. He divinely provided for their salvation, for their protection, and for their guidance. He identified them with Moses, his divinely appointed leader. God provided for their food and water. Yet, in spite of all these divine provisions, the people of Israel failed to enter into the promised land. Only 2 ever made it into the land of Canaan. Wow. What happened there? So this is what I want to suggest. That divine blessings and privileges do not guarantee that one will win the race. Can I say that one more time? That divine blessings and privileges do not guarantee that one will win the race. No one can ever say that they failed to finish the race because they weren't adequately provided for. Those who failed to enter into the promised land were those who fail to appropriate God's provisions. More than that, those who failed to enter into the promised land were those who lacked self-discipline and who died due to their self-indulgence. In a moment, we're going to look into the second half of our text tonight, and we'll realize that actually Paul's writing all the different sins that had led them to fail. The people of Israel to fail to enter into the land of Canaan. In our remaining text, Paul identifies those specific sins which plagued the people of Israel, resulting in their failure to please God and to possess the land of Canaan. So in verse 6, these things happen as a warning to us so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day, nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble as some of them did and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us, for you and I. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. Paul writes that the experiences of our ancestors is for us. And then And again, in verse 11, Paul stresses the importance of these Old Testament stories as they directly bear witness on our lives. The overall lesson to be learned from Israel's wilderness wandering is that we shouldn't crave evil things. Craving evil things is like that self-indulgence which keeps us from winning the race and which kept the Israelites from entering the land of Canaan. We see Paul linking the experiences of the people of Israel directly to the experience of the church in Corinth and with us. They lacked self-discipline, self-control, and they craved evil things. Listen to this in Numbers chapter 11. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Then the Lord's anger blazed against them, and he sent a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. And then fast forward to verse 4. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt, and the people of Israel also began to complain. What? They're now complaining in the wilderness of their old life in Egypt? As what? What were they? Slaves. But now they're complaining of the life they now have in freedom. What's going on? Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlics we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we see is what? Manna. What's wrong with manna? The manna looked like a small coriander seed, and it was pale yellow like gum resin. The people would go out and gather it from the ground. They made flour by grinding it with the hand mills or pounding it with mortars. Then they boiled it in a pot and made it into a flat cake. Sounds like a tongyou bing to me. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. And then fast forward to verse 34. So that place was called Kibroth Hatava, which means graves of gluttony, because there they buried the people who had craved meat from Egypt. How tragic. How tragic is this description of the Israelites in the wilderness? It wasn't that they lacked food to eat, for God provided for their physical needs. They grumbled because they found God's provisions unsavory. They wanted something tastier, something spicier, something ooh la la. They came to despise God's provisions and long for the days of their slavery. The unbridled craving, the fleshly desires of the Israelites, which they sought to satisfy, led to their death in the wilderness. The second failure of the Israelites in the wilderness was that of idolatry. In Exodus 32, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. Come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So Aaron said, take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and sons of daughters and bring them to me. All the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "Oh, Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. So what's interesting about Paul's words in reference to idolatry is that when he refers to the incident, he doesn't make mention of the golden calf, but just that of to eat and to drink, and then the rising up to revelry, partying, pagan style. The third failure of the Israelites was that of immorality. Numbers 25. While the Israelites were camped at Acacia Grove, some of the men defiled themselves by having sexual relations with local Moabite women. These women invited them to attend sacrifices to their gods. So the Israelites feasted with them and worshiped the gods of Moab. In this way, Israel joined in the work of Baal of Peor, causing the Lord's anger to blaze against his people. The Lord issued the following command to Moses: seize all the ringleaders and execute them before the Lord in broad daylight, so his fierce anger will turn away from the people of Israel. So Moses ordered Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death the men under your authority who have joined in worshiping Baal of Peor." Just then, one of the Israelite men brought a Midianite woman into his tent, right before the eyes of Moses and all the people. As everyone was weeping at the entrance of the tabernacle, when Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, and the priest saw this, he jumped up and left the assembly. He took a spear and rushed after the man into his tent. Phinehas thrust the spear all the way through the man's body and into the woman's stomach. So the plague against the Israelite was stopped, but not before 24,000 people had died. The Israelites fell into immorality with the Moabite woman as they joined with them in their idol worship. The people ate and bowed down to their gods. And then the fourth failure that the Israelites was that of trying the Lord or putting the Lord to the test. In Exodus 17, at the Lord's command, the whole community of Israel left the wilderness of sin and moved from the place to place. Eventually, they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. So once more, the people complained against Moses. "Give us water to drink," they demanded. "Quiet," Moses replied. "Why are you complaining against me, and why are you testing the Lord?" But tormented by thirst, they continued to argue with Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Are you trying to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What should I do with these people? They are ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Walk out in front of the people. Take your staff, the one you used when you struck the water of the Nile, and call some of the elders of Israel to join you. I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink." So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out as elders looked on. Moses named the place Massah, which means test, and Meribah, which means arguing, because the people of Israel argued with Moses and tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord here with us or not?" See, putting God to the test was demanding that God meet their perceived needs in the way which they demanded. The question of Exodus 17:7 sums it all up. Is the Lord here with us or not? The question for us tonight that we can ask ourselves is, how do we know if the Lord's with us? Is it some miracle that He does in our life, that He shows us through dreams or symbols, that we then know that He's actively engaged in our everyday lives? Or is it a peace that we might have in our hearts of knowing that the world is just chaotic, but somehow He's given us, you and I, this ability to be centered in Him? The way the Israelites determined God's presence among them was that of them counting the blessings of how God provides for them. So you remember that Satan's first temptation of Jesus was an effort to entice Him to turn stones into bread. God had led Him into the wilderness to be without food or water. Satan's assumption was that of the same as the Israelites. If God's really with someone, then they wouldn't lack anything they needed or desired. Satan's second temptation of Jesus was to convince Him to jump from the highest point of the temple, reminding Him of the biblical assurance of angelic protection. Jesus, still dealing with Satan from the context of the early chapters of Deuteronomy, reminded Satan of the evil of putting God to the test, of trying to make God jump through our hoops. And finally, the ancient Israelites, the people of Israel, failed by grumbling. In Exodus 16, There, too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Is that how we look at the way life has been for each and every one of us? Do you feel like you rather be where you were before than where you are in this very moment? See, the grumbling of the Israelites was about food. They recalled the meat they had eaten in Egypt and grumbled against Moses and God for leading them into the desert to starve to death. You remember this story that in Numbers 16, I'm not going to read it, but you can go back to it later on. But that Korah and Dathan and Abiram and 250 others from among the leaders of Israel rose up against Moses, protesting against his prominence and authority. In the events that followed, these rebels were swallowed up alive by the earth. Along with their families, God's act of discipline performed through the hand of Moses didn't strike fear into the hearts of the people who on the following day grumbled against Moses, blaming him for the deaths of those who had perished for their rebellion. Now, the real issue is on the table, out in the open. It's not really about what's right or even about one's rights. The issue is how we perceive and we take on this idea of self-indulgence, about being, it's all about me, of how I perceive the reality that's before me. When God is trying to help us to see His reality before us. Paul's consistent with the rest of the Word of God in calling us to a life of discipline. Discipleship is, after all, founded on discipline, not only in its terminology, but in its essence and expression. We are all disciples of Jesus Christ. How has He given us the ability to be disciplined so that we might prioritize our lives in such a way that places Him before us as the prize each and every single day? Not just someday down the road, but now. When Jesus preached, He didn't offer an easy path, nor did He promise earthly prosperity. He spoke of taking up one's cross and of selling one's possessions. He was careful never to give the impression that following Him was going to be easy. He didn't conceal the cost that it would take to be a disciple of His. The cost of discipleship. Jesus Himself practiced a very self-discipline and self-denial, which He advocated and which Paul requires of us in our text. From the very beginning, Jesus knew that He had come to the world to serve, and He gave His life as a ransom for many. He consistently positioned and purposed Himself to fulfill His calling and to carry out the will of His Father. He came with a mission that He knew He would be the one to accomplish. And He would not be distracted by all the wonderful things that life on earth in this world would offer. The fulfillment of His calling was death on a cross so that we may be made right with God and have life eternal. Never was there anyone who better exemplified the will and self-sacrifice to win than Jesus? And it's because he completed his course that we may fulfill our calling as well. Christ's victory over sin, death, and the grave is the basis for our sure victory. And so this is the case with Paul. And I want to leave what he said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4 as we close. As for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have remained faithful. And now the prize awaits me, the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on the day of his return. And the prize is not just for me, but for all who eagerly look forward to his appearing. To all of us. Can I invite the music team up? Would you close your eyes with me?